My dad was living in Alpine, Texas when Texas blacked out. And I was like, there's no such thing as a strong country with a weak grid. That just like doesn't happen. And because I had done all of these historical deep dives on top of that, I started to really understand like inertia and entropy in like historical terms. And I was like, if this stuff keeps going wrong, it's not clear that there's like an off ramp. Texas is a weird case because Texas is technically an island grid. So like one of the things that happened during the ice storm Uri, right, where Texas had those really tragic blackouts where many people died, is that everybody was like, oh, if they could import power, they'd be fine, you know, but that wasn't true. You know, everybody else, I mean, it was a huge Arctic storm that covered like the entire third of the country. Yeah. Everybody else they didn't have anything to spare, first of all. So Texas is actually like a really weird, unique market to pay attention to, right? Because they don't have these things called like seasonal capacity markets where 3 years ahead of the time they have an auction to see which plants are going to be available for a difficult winter season 3 years out from now, right? Like that's what PJM and a few others have. They have seasonal capacity markets. Texas prides itself on being energy only. And what that means is that they're just doing it real time, baby. They're not doing any of this other stuff that like rewards incumbent utilities for having, you know, reliable power plants around. They're doing that for real.
We'll do it live.
Yeah, they're doing it live, you know, like that's what's going on there. So I don't really know about like what the export game in Texas is like because they also aren't necessarily under the aegis of FERC in the same way that the other markets are in the rest of the country because it's Texas and Texas wants to do whatever it wants, you know, which is like what I love about Texas. But I've talked to energy traders in ERCOT. That's like the name of its grid operator. And they're like, yeah, I don't know what's going on. You know? And there are all sorts of like complex reasons for that like, it seems like they don't even completely understand. And so I don't totally understand it. I mean, that's part of the problem, right? So we look at some of the rules and regulations for running the grid. Part of it is that it is just become so difficult to manage a system that complex. So FERC is trying to put in these new rules about siting transmission and stuff like that. And the new rule that they have is over 1,000 pages. It's like, okay, how many of those do you guys have? And then how many lawyers do you need to figure that out? And then how do you coordinate that? And we're dealing with multiple layers of stuff here, right? So, you know, I was talking to the chief nuclear officer at Entergy, a big, you know, utility out in the South and the Midwest. And I was like, how are you guys doing this? Because you have your footprint, but then you have to work with a bunch of different state governments, but then you have to work with the federal government. And then you also have to work with the grid operator and the power market. And understandably, the only answer she could give me is transparency is very important. Because how the hell do you answer that question, you know, in like a succinct way? Yeah. Right. So I think that that's also part of what's happening now, too. It's like the overcomplication of what used to be a simple system. And this is the fatal irony of restructuring, is that it created, like many other things in this country, it became a jobs program for lawyers.
A lot of people, when they think about energy policy, they think about where the energy comes from: wind, solar, nuclear, oil and gas. There's plenty of food fights in the public square on that, and we will talk about that. But why does the grid itself matter? What is the energy infrastructure that undergirds our country that people pay even less attention to than the energy issues? And why do they matter?
Yeah, so I would say like the grid, I was actually just talking to like somebody who's become a mentor to me, Robert Bryce, who everybody should go listen to his Power Hungry podcast and read his books. Robert's great. And one of the things that he and I were talking about is that like the grid isn't just the electrical system, right? Which is generation, transmission, and distribution. So it's like the power line, plant, the power lines, and then how it gets into your house, you know, or whatever, or how it gets to the factory. All of that's important, obviously. But it's also like bunch of natural gas pipelines. It's also a rail system that brings all the coal to wherever it is. Like it's all of the, well, because New England's in a particularly tight spot and refuses to build pipelines to a shale formation. It's all of the LNG cargo that shows up in New England and stuff like that. It is all of these things sort of put together that give us everything we do every day. Right. So like a thought experiment would be to ask yourself at the end of the day, what did I do today that didn't require electricity? and try to list the things, and it's probably going to be like none, right? Like all of it requires.
Even my toothbrush is electric.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like all of it requires that. And it is really like I call it the industrial commons. It's not necessary. It's obviously not public. This is America. We only have a few public and municipal things, but it is this intricate tapestry of about 3,000 different organizations and stuff like that, and 3 different interconnections that have multiple layers of regulation that all work together fitfully, frustratingly, to make sure that we can maintain the standard of wealth that we have today.
And so what are the biggest threats to our grid and its security in the modern era?
Yeah. So that's a big question. There's a sort of, it's important to understand a little bit about the history of it. So obviously electricity comes around as cutting edge technology in the Victorian era, basically. And America is beginning its transition in that moment from being the largely agrarian, more Jeffersonian, I would say, republic, to something that had big industrial systems. And that would have a lot of political and I would say like political economic fallout. But physics tends towards scale, and electricity was really good for that, right? So as soon as we could start to build power plants, and as soon as we had alternating current, which allowed us to move power longer distances, we started to build these large systems, and they grew into regulated monopolies in the 30s. Out of deep frustration with his experience with regulated monopolies in New York State, FDR went to create public entities and to do some rural electrification. But those were never meant to be like a total socialist takeover of the entire system. He described them as like a yardstick and a switch, right? So you're supposed to be able to like measure whether or not private utilities were being honest or discipline them if they weren't. And that's how that was supposed to work. But out of this, the administrative state is born, right? And what happens with nuclear energy is the perfect example. So the plutonium for the Manhattan Project is made by the Tennessee Valley Authority, and it is made by the coal there, right? So it starts to strip mine for coal to power making plutonium. And then when they want to figure out how to do peaceful uses after the war, David Lilienthal, who was the first, like the head honcho at the TVA, becomes the first commissioner of the Atomic Energy Commission. And that has a direct relationship with the utilities. So I'm trying to paint this picture here of the way in which our extended republic collided into the industrial demands of the electric system. And by the time the 70s rolled around, people both left and right, like you can read like Barry Goldwater's speechwriter Carl Hess, and he sounds like Amory Lovins over at the Rocky Mountain Institute, famous lefty. And they wanted to move away from the administrative state into something else. And Carter would be the fulcrum around which that happened, because he had to deal with stagflation. He had to deal with energy crises, and the way that the sort of New Deal order was constructed on this corporatist compact was like coming apart. And a lot of the regulations simply weren't working anymore. So in the 80s and the 90s, by the 90s, it's like Enron and the environmental movement are like, we need to deregulate electricity. We can't have these monopoly utilities anymore. There needs to be room for the little guy. And by the little guy, they really meant natural gas and solar and wind. And that's what they wanted, because they knew that for monopoly utilities, there was no point in really investing in any of that stuff. Natural gas, sure. But as far as like wind and solar goes, you don't really get a lot out of the rate base in that. And also they're a pain to deal with because they're intermittent. So especially at the time, like even more so than now. So you have all these new load balancing challenges that if you're a monopoly utility, you're like, I'm not trying to invite more problems into my life. Like everybody already hates me, so no thanks. But they knew if they pried open these markets into basically like big auction houses through a series of FERC orders in the 90s, we could perhaps get reliably cheap power and peel back some of these administrative state layers and sort of these like state corporate compacts to create a more competitive system, right? A more like libertarian way of looking at it. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean it, descriptively. So that brings us to today, right? After the fracking boom, after all of this, natural gas is like 40% of the electricity production on the grid last year. What are the threats to the grid now? Well, none of that worked. Basically, what happened is we created yet more layers of bureaucracy and difficulty and complication in running the electricity system in the hopes of creating, I think it was like in FERC Order 888, reliability at least cost. And we've done neither of those two things. So the grid is starting to become more unreliable. And there are several reasons for that. So one of the reasons is that these markets, right? So the way that they work is they're sort of like auction houses, right? And everybody bids in to supply power like 5 minutes, 30 minutes, hour, day ahead, week ahead. And then you have like seasonal stuff, right? They all bid in to supply power.
This is in like megawatt hours or?
Yeah. So think about it as like meeting demand. Like the grid operator's like, oh, okay, we need like X amount of power. Who's going to give that? And all these people are like, I can give it to you at this much. I can give it to you at this much. I can give it to you that much. And then it picks one of the lower ones and then sort of the next 3 or 4 after that. And then the higher price stuff gets cut out, right? And that's how it delivers least cost through competition. That's the idea. I mean, I'm sort of butchering it a little bit, but if we got really into the weeds here, we'd be here all day. And this would basically be like taking an Ambien for your listeners. But that's the general premise. What that incentivized is a lot of heavily subsidized wind and solar that distorted the price signal and made it look like they were producing free power, or sometimes like, I'll pay you to take this type of power. And the natural gas turbines that could catch up to meet demand when the wind stops blowing or the sun sets, because the turbines can just ramp up more than like a coal plant or a nuclear plant could. Over time, that has had the impact of shoving more and more coal and nuclear off the grid. And this wasn't a surprise, right? Like this is when you see the Enron documents, when you see what Aubrey McClendon's talking about with natural gas in the early 2000s, and why he gives the Sierra Club like $25 million to go after coal is because they know what it's going to replace, right? Like that's this. So this is why they're doing this. And it did have a salutary effect, by the way, bringing down emissions. But what it also did is it fragilized our whole system, because now each section of the grid that's in one of these markets is seeing its what's called base load plants. Those are the big, reliable coal and nuclear plants shut off because they can't compete with free in air quotes. And they can't do the volatility. So they can't make money. So they're not worth keeping around for the people that own them. And everybody is starting to depend on exports from each other, right? So we're in DC right now. DC is in PJM, which is, I think, the largest power market in the world and definitely the largest in the country. PJM stretches all the way to where I live in Illinois, right? To give you, that's 13 states. I think they serve like 60 million people in the US. And they put out a report in February that says all our coal plants and all this stuff is shutting off. We're expecting 40 gigawatt shortfalls by the end of the decade, which is enough power to serve 32 million households here. They're about to lose like 25 or maybe a fifth of their installed capacity, and nothing can replace it.
And that's because they're no longer market viable.
Yeah, they're not market viable. Or, the regulations have ratcheted up. Certainly the new EPA guidelines on emissions will take a scythe to both coal and natural gas. And we can get into some of that later. But yeah, generally they're no longer market viable, and nothing is coming on fast enough to replace it. Right? Because wind and solar can't replace it. And it's not just PJM, right? MISO, its neighbor, which stretches from Minnesota to Louisiana in its upper region, is having the same problem. California is having to keep on a ton of dirty gas plants in violation of some of its own environmental law to keep the lights on. Texas has issued 3 conservation orders this summer to get people to reduce using power to keep the grid safe. And 2 of them happened within the last week, as of this recording, I believe. And then when you look at New England's in the same problem. It is burning oil to get through the winters. But they don't know what they're going to do, in terms of where's their power going to come from if they can't import from PJM. MISO relies on PJM for when its wind fleet fails. So it's basically what this woman, Meredith Angwin, who writes this book, Shorting the Grid, on this, who's a dear friend of mine. I call her the Bubby of the grid. She's a sweet old Jewish grandma in Vermont who's an engineer. And she wrote a book that explains how all these markets work, but she calls it the fatal trifecta, which is over-reliance on just-in-time natural gas, an overabundance of intermittent resources, wind and solar, and an overdependence on your neighbors. If everybody pursues all of these policies at once, all their renewable portfolio standards that take advantage of all those sweet, sweet production tax credits, that have been lavishly doled out to them, they're going to be running into these problems. And then we can start to see, as grid operators and as the North American Electric Reliability Corp, NERC, which is the nonprofit that's nonpartisan and looks over all of this stuff for the federal government, we will see it becoming more and more vulnerable to simple fluctuations in weather.